There is a place on this planet
So far from everything else that for most of human history, no one knew it was there. It sits in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, 2,400 miles from the nearest continent, nearly 4,000 from the next one. No landmass close enough to see, no neighbor close enough to help. It is the most isolated population center in the world. No city of any real size sits farther from another. And 1.4 million people live there. They live in cities, they drive on highways, they shop in grocery stores that look like any other grocery store in America. The shelves are full, the lights stay on. But almost nothing on those shelves was grown there. Between 85 and 90% of the food is shipped in, across 2,400 miles of open water. At any given moment, the islands hold roughly 10 days of fresh produce. Both of these things are true at the same time. This is the most remote inhabited place on Earth, and it is one of the most dependent. A modern society with a modern appetite, balanced on the end of the longest supply line in the country. If the ship stopped, the question would not be how comfortable life would be. The question would be how long it would last. So how do you actually live here? Not visit, not vacation. Live. Raise children, grow old, bury your parents on islands this far from the rest of the world. This is Hawaii. Most people arrive here already knowing what it is. A honeymoon, a beach, a flight you take once in your life and talk about for years afterward. Palm trees and a drink with fruit in it. That picture is real. But it is the thinnest possible layer over something much older and much stranger. Because long before Hawaii was a vacation, it was a problem to be solved. The problem of how anything survives this far out. And the islands answered that problem twice, once perfectly and once not at all. Start with the land itself, because even the ground here had to travel a long way to exist. The Hawaiian Islands are not part of any continent. They were never connected to one. Every grain of soil, every cliff, every black sand beach began as molten rock, pushed up from the floor of the Pacific by a single, stationary hotspot deep in the Earth's mantle. The plate above it drifts northwest a few inches a year. The hotspot stays put. And so, one after another, it has punched a chain of volcanoes up through the sea floor, a conveyor belt of islands stretching across 1,500 miles of ocean. The oldest are in the northwest, worn down to atolls and reefs, sinking slowly back beneath the waves. The youngest is still being built. On the Big Island, the volcano Kilauea is among the most active on the planet. It does not erupt in rare, violent bursts so much as it bleeds. For years at a stretch, lava simply pours from it, hardening into new black rock at the island's edge. This is land being made in real time. You can stand and watch the map of the United States get a little larger. To the Hawaiians, this fire has a name and a will. It is Pele, the volcano goddess, who lives in the craters and remakes the land as she pleases. The lava is not a disaster in this telling. It is creation, ongoing, a little dangerous, never finished. And almost the moment the rock cools, life answers it. The first plant to take root on raw lava is usually a single hardy tree, the ohia lehua, with its tufts of red blossoms. It colonizes bare stone where nothing else can, and from its shelter, the rest of the forest slowly follows. In legend, the ohia and the lehua flower are two lovers. To pick the blossom, it is said, is to separate them, and the skies will weep with rain. The Hawaiians built their stories directly into the way their world is made, but living on a volcano that never quite stops is not only mythology, it is a daily calculation. When Kilauea sends a river of lava through a residential subdivision, as it did in 2018, swallowing hundreds of homes whole, the people in its path have hours, sometimes less, to decide what they can carry and what they will lose. They rebuild anyway, often within sight of the same vents. To live here is to accept that the ground itself is a tenant, not a fixture. It can be taken back. And rising above it all is Mauna Kea. Measured from the ocean floor where its base begins, it stands 33,000 feet, taller than Everest. Most of it is hidden underwater. Only the top 13,000 feet break the surface. So this is the stage. A chain of volcanic peaks, alone in the middle of the Pacific, with the nearest help 2,000 miles in any direction. The next question is how life ever reached it. When those first islands cooled, they were sterile, bare rock, no plants, no insects, no birds. Anything that lived here had to cross thousands of miles of open ocean to get here, by accident. A seed caught in a storm, a spider drifting on a thread of silk, a single exhausted bird blown far off course that happened to make landfall and happened to find a mate. Scientists estimate that a new species successfully colonized these islands on average about once every 10,000 years. That is how rare the journey was. But here is what isolation does. The few that made it found a world with no competition and no predators, and so they changed. A single finch arrived from North America sometime in the deep past. From that one ancestor, over millions of years, evolution carved more than 50 different species of bird. The Hawaiian honeycreepers. Some grew long, curved bills to drink nectar from native flowers. Others developed thick beaks to crack seeds. One evolved a bill like a pair of pliers, a straight lower half to pry bark, a curved upper half to hook out the grubs underneath. Different tools, different jobs, all carved from the same starting material. This is one of the clearest examples of evolution ever found anywhere on Earth. Charles Darwin had his finches in the Galapagos. Hawaii had 50 of them. Of those 50-plus species, 17 remain. The rest are gone. When humans arrived, they brought the things isolation had kept out: rats, mosquitoes, disease. Avian malaria, carried by introduced mosquitoes, swept through the lowland forests. The honeycreepers had no defense against it. Whole species vanished within a few decades of contact. The survivors retreated uphill into the cold, high forests where mosquitoes could not follow. For a century, the cold was their shield. Now the climate is warming, the mosquitoes are climbing, and the birds are running out of mountain. Today, more than 3/4 of Hawaii's native birds are extinct or endangered. It is, by some measures, the fastest extinction event on the planet. A place that built its own private bestiary over millions of years is losing it in the span of a few human lifetimes. Not every story here ends that way. A few of these creatures have learned to hold on. High in the volcanic uplands lives a goose found nowhere else on Earth, the nene. Its feet have lost most of their webbing, reshaped over thousands of years for walking on rough lava instead of swimming. It is, in a literal sense, a goose that gave up the water to live on a mountain of stone. By the middle of the 20th century, there were fewer than 30 of them left in the world. What saved the Nene was nothing dramatic. It was decades of patient, unglamorous work, captive breeding, predator control, people counting nests one by one. The bird is still rare. It is still struggling, but it is still here. And it is here because someone decided it was worth the trouble. In the waters around the islands swims another survivor, the Hawaiian monk seal. Its name in the Hawaiian language means roughly, the dog that runs in rough water. It is one of the rarest seals on the planet, and it exists in only one place, here. These are the island's oldest residents. They arrived by accident, survived by luck, and changed beyond recognition in the long silence before anyone was watching. And then, more than 1,000 years ago, something arrived that had not come by accident at all. It came on purpose. It came by canoe. And it came across the open ocean with no instruments of any kind. To understand the people who live in Hawaii, you have to understand how they got here in the first place. Because the answer to that question is the same as the answer to how they survived. The first Hawaiians were Polynesians, master navigators from the islands of the South Pacific. Somewhere between roughly 1,500 and 1,700 years ago, they pointed double-hulled voyaging canoes north into open water and sailed toward a place no one had ever confirmed was there. They had no compass, no charts, no metal, no clocks, nothing we would recognize as instruments. What they had was the sky, the sea, and a body of knowledge passed down by memory for generations. A navigator read the rising and setting points of the stars. He read the direction and the shape of the ocean's swells, feeling them through the hull of the canoe in the dark. He watched the flight lines of birds at dawn and dusk, knowing which species slept on land. He read the color of the water and the shape of the clouds that gather over an island still below the horizon. Picture the moment of arrival. A canoe, weeks at sea, the crew exhausted, water running low, and then a single bird flying out from a point on the empty horizon. A smudge of cloud that does not move with the others. A change in the swell, bending around something solid ahead. Land. The most isolated land on Earth, found by people steering with the stars. They did not just find it, they settled it. They brought with them, in those canoes, everything they would need to build a world. Taro and breadfruit, pigs and chickens, the plants for medicine and cloth. They carried an entire civilization across the ocean in wooden boats. Think about what that actually required. They did not arrive and hope to find food. They brought it with them. A careful cargo of around 24 plants and animals, chosen because a society could be built on them. Taro for the staple, breadfruit and banana and sweet potato for the fields, coconut for water and oil and rope and timber, the paper mulberry whose bark they would pound into cloth, kava and tea and gourd and sugarcane, pigs, dogs and chickens. They are still called the canoe plants, the founding inventory of the Hawaiian world, loaded into hulls and ferried across the widest ocean on Earth. And once they landed, they faced the same problem the seeds and the birds had faced. There was no help coming. Nothing could be shipped in. Whatever they needed, they would have to make from the islands themselves. What they built to solve that problem was extraordinary, and almost no one who vacations here ever hears its name. It was called the Ahupua'a. The islands were divided not into squares, but into wedges, long pie slices of land running from the mountain peaks all the way down to the sea. Each wedge contained a complete world. The high forest at the top for timber and birds and fresh rainwater, the fertile midlands for farming, the coast and the reef for fish and salt. One slice of land held everything a community needed to feed and clothe and shelter itself. A family in a single Ahupua'a could live, in principle, without taking a thing from anyone else. Here is how it worked. In the well-watered valleys, Hawaiians built loi, terraced ponds for growing taro, the staple crop, and in their belief, the elder sibling of the Hawaiian people. Streams from the mountains were channeled through one terrace after another, the same water feeding field after field on its way down to the sea. And at the very bottom, where the fresh water met the ocean, they built something almost no other culture on Earth ever managed: fish ponds. A loko'ia was a great stone wall, curved out into the shallow sea to enclose a pond against the shoreline. Built into the wall were grates, makaha, spaced so that small young fish could swim in from the ocean with the tide. They fed and grew fat on the algae inside the calm, warm water, and then they could no longer fit back out through the grates. The ocean stocked the pond for free. The wall did the rest. It was a fish farm that ran on the tide. This was not subsistence at the edge of survival. At its height, before any outsider arrived, the Ahupua'a system fed a population that some estimates place close to that of the islands today. On these same islands, with no imports, no engines, no outside help of any kind. The principle underneath it all was a single Hawaiian saying: "He ali'i ka'aina, he kaua ke kanaka." The land is the chief, man is its servant. You did not own the land, you belonged to it, and your job was to care for it so it could keep caring for you. They had a word for that too: malama aina. To tend, to protect, to keep. And they had a system to enforce it. Each Ahupua'a was overseen by a manager called the konohiki, who answered to the chief and decided how the land and water would be used. Above all of it sat the kapu, a strict code of sacred law that governed nearly everything. Some of those laws were spiritual, but many were, in effect, the world's earliest conservation rules. When a fish was spawning, the konohiki could place a kapu on it. No one could take that species until the season passed and the stock recovered. Forests had limits on what could be cut. The reef, the stream, the upland, each had its rules, and breaking them carried real consequences. It was, in modern terms, resource management with the force of religion behind it. The islands did not stay productive by accident. They stayed productive because an entire society agreed, generation after generation, not to take more than the land could give back. For 1,000 years, that was the answer to the question this whole place asks. How do you live on the most isolated islands on Earth? You make them give you everything, and you give everything back. On the windward coast of Oahu, parts of that old system still stand. At He'ea, an 800-year-old fish pond is being rebuilt, stone by stone, by people pulling invasive mangrove out of the walls their ancestors laid. The wall is most of a mile long. They are restoring it by hand. It is slow and it is small against the scale of a modern state. But it is proof of something. The knowledge is not entirely lost. It is buried the way the walls were buried, and it can be dug back out. But to understand why it had to be dug back out, why a system that worked for 1,000 years was abandoned at all, you have to look at what happened when the outside world finally arrived. In January of 1778, the British captain James Cook became the first European to land on these islands. Within a few decades, the world the Hawaiians had built began to come apart. The newcomers brought trade and tools and ambition. They also brought diseases the islanders had no immunity to. The native population, which may have numbered several 100,000, collapsed. By some estimates, losing 80 or 90% of its people within a century of contact. And the land itself began to change hands. American and European businessmen saw in these islands not a home to be tended, but a resource to be worked. They planted sugar, then pineapple, vast plantations growing single crops for export on land that had once fed the people who lived on it. To work those plantations, they brought in laborers from Japan, China, the Philippines, Portugal, Korea. It is why Hawaii today is one of the most ethnically blended places in America, a state where no single group is a majority. That mixing is real, and much of it is beautiful. It also began as an industrial labor supply for fields the Hawaiians no longer controlled. Out of that crowded, polyglot plantation world, though, something genuinely new was born. Workers who shared no common language invented one. A pidgin, stitched together from Hawaiian, English, Japanese, Portuguese, and more, that is still spoken on the islands today. They blended their foods into a cuisine no other place has: the plate lunch, the spam musubi, the shave ice. They built an identity that calls itself simply local, neither fully of the mainland nor purely of old Hawaii, but its own thing, grown in the space between. It is one of the few gifts the plantation era left behind, and the people of Hawaii hold it dearly. By the late 1800s, the men who owned the plantations had more money than the kingdom that governed them, and they wanted the kingdom too. On the 17th of January, 1893, they take it. A group of mostly American businessmen, calling themselves the Committee of Safety, move against the Queen. Liliuokalani, the first woman to rule the kingdom and the last person ever to rule it, has been trying to restore power to the Hawaiian people and their crown. The businessmen will not allow it. A warship, the USS Boston, sits in Honolulu Harbor. Sailors and Marines come ashore, officially to protect American lives. The Queen is surrounded. To prevent bloodshed she cannot win, she yields, under protest, expecting the United States government to right the wrong. It never does. 2 years later, after her supporters attempt to restore her, the Queen is arrested and placed under house arrest inside her own palace, the only royal palace on American soil. Forced to sign away her throne to spare the lives of her people, she spends her imprisonment composing music. In 1898, the United States annexes the islands outright. An independent nation, more than 1,000 years old, was gone, not conquered in a war, taken by the owners of its own farmland. Let that sit for a moment, because it explains a great deal of what comes after. The system that had fed these islands for a millennium was not lost to some natural disaster. It was dismantled, deliberately, and replaced with an economy built to send things away, not to sustain the people who stayed. There is one more piece of that history, and it is the hardest. Because in a place defined by isolation, the islands did something cruel with isolation itself. They used it as a punishment. In the 1860s, as foreign diseases spread, leprosy reached the islands. The kingdom's response, urged on by foreign advisors, was to remove the sick entirely. On the north coast of the island of Molokai lies a small peninsula called Kalaupapa, flat, green, and walled off from the rest of the island by some of the tallest sea cliffs in the world. There is almost no way in and no way out. People diagnosed with leprosy were taken from their families and sent there. Some were lowered from ships into the surf and told to swim for shore. Husbands were separated from wives, children from parents, and most never saw them again. Over the span of roughly a century, some 8,000 people were exiled to that strip of land to live out their days. In 1873, a Belgian priest named Joseph de Voister, Father Damien, asked to be sent there. He did not have to go. He built coffins and houses. He dressed wounds no one else would touch. He gave the abandoned back some measure of dignity. And after 16 years among them, he stood before his congregation and began a sermon not with the words, "My brothers," but with, "We lepers." He had caught it too. He died there, among the people he had chosen. A handful of patients, now cured but grown old in the only home they remember, still live at Kalaupapa today, by choice. Isolation took everything from them. In the end, it was also the only place left that was theirs. So that is the weight these islands carry beneath the surface. Now lift your eyes back up, because isolation here is not only a wound. Sometimes it is the rarest kind of gift. Go back to the summit of Mauna Kea. Above 13,000 feet, the air is thin, dry, and astonishingly still. There are no cities for 2,000 miles to throw light into the sky. On most nights, the stars come down to the horizon in numbers most people will never see in their lives. It is, for that reason, one of the finest places on Earth to look at the universe. A cluster of the world's most powerful telescopes sits on that summit, peering billions of years into the past. But the summit is also among the most sacred places in the Hawaiian world, the meeting point of earth and sky, the realm of the gods. And so a deep tension lives on that mountain. The same isolation that makes it perfect for studying the heavens makes it holy to the people who have always lived beneath it. Telescopes and prayer, science and ancestry contending for the highest ground in the Pacific. There is no easy answer, and the islanders are still living inside the question. The geography keeps offering these extremes. On the island of Kauai, the oldest and greenest of the main islands, a peak called Waialeale catches the trade winds and wrings them out. It receives in an average year around 450 inches of rain, making it one of the wettest spots on the entire planet. A few miles away, the same island holds near desert. Two opposite worlds on one small island made by nothing more than which way the wind blows over a mountain. And the chain keeps going, full of small worlds most visitors never reach. There is Ni'ihau, privately held for more than a century and a half, closed to outsiders, where a few hundred people still speak Hawaiian as their daily language. There is Kaho'olawe, used for decades as a military bombing range, now slowly being healed and replanted. Far to the northwest stretch the uninhabited islands, reefs and atolls protected inside one of the largest marine reserves on Earth, the place where the chain grows old and sinks away. On Maui rises Haleakala, a volcano so high its summit holds a frost-rimmed crater. And there, in that thin air, grows the silver sword, a plant of curved silver leaves that exists nowhere else, that lives for decades as a low rosette, blooms once in a tall spire of flowers, and then dies. One bloom in a whole lifetime on the side of a volcano in the middle of the sea. Hawaii is also the only place in the United States that grows coffee as a commercial crop on the volcanic slopes above Kona. And it is, of course, the birthplace of surfing, a sport invented by people who understood the ocean as well as anyone ever has. Down at the small scale, the islands hide their oddities too. On the underside of leaves in the wet forest lives a spider barely the size of a grain of rice. Its body carries a pattern of red and yellow markings that by pure accident of evolution looks exactly like a smiling face. They call it the happy face spider, and like so much here, it lives on these islands and nowhere else in the world. A tiny, grinning reminder of what a few million years of solitude can produce. All of this, the volcanoes, the birds, the sacred summit, the grinning spider, the 1,000-year-old fish ponds, all of it sits 2,400 miles from anywhere. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Not how beautiful it is, how it works. Because today, almost none of those old answers feed the people who live here. Turn now to the present, and to the one island where most of those people actually are. 70% of Hawaii's population, over 1 million people, lives on a single island, Oahu. And most of them live in and around one city, Honolulu. Honolulu is a real city. Towers of glass and concrete, freeways thick with traffic, suburbs climbing the green ridges behind downtown. From the right angle, it could be San Diego or Miami or any Sunbelt American city. That is exactly the point. A modern American metropolis with all of a modern city's hungers, sitting on a rock in the middle of the Pacific. And there is a reason a distant power wanted these islands badly enough to take them. The same isolation that makes Hawaii so hard to supply makes it priceless to control. A naval base here commands the entire Central Pacific. Every sea lane between America and Asia passes within reach. That was the logic behind the deep harbor the islanders called Waimomi, the waters of Pearl. Pearl Harbor became the most important American outpost in the ocean, and on a December morning in 1941, its strategic value drew the islands into the center of a world war in a single hour. That military presence never left. Today, the armed forces are one of the largest forces in Hawaii's economy, second only to tourism. Tens of thousands of personnel and their families, vast tracts of land, billions of dollars flowing in from far away. It is one more way the islands are tethered to a mainland 2,000 miles off. The position that makes Hawaii lonely is the same position that makes it valuable. Isolation, once again, cutting both ways. And every one of those hungers is fed through one narrow channel. Honolulu Harbor is the lifeline of the entire state. Through it passes something like 80 to 90% of everything Hawaii consumes. The food, the fuel, the lumber, the cars, the medicine, the goods on every store shelf. It nearly all arrives by ship at this one harbor, on this one island, and is then distributed out to the others. This is the paradox made physical. 1.5 million people on the most isolated islands on Earth, depending almost entirely on a steady stream of container ships from 2,400 miles away. State emergency planners have studied what happens if that channel closes: a major hurricane, a tsunami, a port shutdown. Their own findings are sobering. There is very little stored food on the islands. The harbor could take 19 days or more to fully reopen. And the fresh produce in the stores, as we said at the start, runs out in about 10. The people who lived here 1,000 years ago could have fed themselves indefinitely. The people who live here now are, in a real sense, never more than a couple of weeks from empty shelves. The islands grew far more capable and far more fragile at exactly the same time. How did the self-sufficient islands become the dependent ones? The turning point has a date. In 1959, Hawaii became the 50th American state. It was a moment of pride, and for many, of real opportunity. It was also almost exactly the last time the islands grew anything close to half of their own food. What replaced the farms was not more farms. It was visitors. Stand on the beach at Waikiki, and you can watch the engine of the modern economy at work. A wall of hotels rises behind a crescent of sand that was, a century ago, a district of wetlands and fish ponds and taro fields. Today, it draws travelers from across the world. Roughly 10 million of them come to Hawaii every year, 7 visitors for every resident. Tourism brought money and jobs and a way to live that did not depend on plantations, but it deepened the very problem it was solving. 10 million visitors all need to be fed, and they are fed the same way everyone else is, by ship, from far away. The hotels needed reliable, year-round quantities of food that local farms could never match. So the islands leaned harder on imports, and the old fields filled in with resorts and houses, and the knowledge of how to feed this place quietly slipped another generation further away. And the cost of simply existing here climbed. Land is finite on an island. Demand is not. Hawaii became the most expensive state in the country to live in, where families spend a larger share of their income on rent than anywhere else in America. Out in the water beyond the hotels, sometimes a Hawaiian monk seal hauls itself onto the sand to rest. Beachgoers are asked to keep their distance, to give the rarest of residents room. It is a strange and quiet meeting, one of the last few thousand of an ancient island species lying on a beach surrounded by one of the most crowded shorelines in the Pacific. Both of them, in their way, running out of room. Not every meeting at the water's edge is a sad one. Hauling out on those same beaches more and more often is the honu, the green sea turtle. To Hawaiians, it is an aumakua, a family guardian, a spirit in the shape of an animal. A few decades ago, it had been hunted to the edge. Then it was protected and left alone and given time. Today, it is one of the island's clearest comebacks. Turtles basking openly on the sand while people step quietly around them. It is a small, living argument that decline here is not always permanent. Sometimes, given room, the islands heal. In August of 2023, the pressure on this place turned to catastrophe. On Maui, a wind-driven wildfire swept into the historic town of Lahaina, once the capital of the Hawaiian kingdom, and destroyed almost all of it in a matter of hours. It became the deadliest American wildfire in more than a century. Thousands of homes were gone, and in the weeks that followed, many of the families who lost everything faced a second loss. With nowhere affordable to rebuild, some began to wonder whether they could stay in Hawaii at all, which is the quietest crisis on these islands and maybe the deepest. It is not only the food that has to be imported now. Increasingly, it is hard for the people of Hawaii to remain in Hawaii. Some are trying to change that by going back to the beginning. Across the islands, a quiet movement has taken hold to grow food in Hawaii again. Young Hawaiians are returning to the loi, pulling weeds out of taro terraces their great-grandparents farmed, reopening fish ponds like the one at He'ea, planting breadfruit by the thousand. And the strange thing is, the numbers say it could work. Researchers have estimated that with the right land and the right use, as little as 6% of Hawaii's surface could feed its entire population. The climate grows almost anything. The knowledge, half buried, still exists. The islands once fed more than 1 million people with no help at all. There is no law of nature that says they cannot do it again. But there is a wall of economics in the way. It is nearly impossible to make a living farming in Hawaii. Land is staggeringly expensive. Imported food, grown cheaply at industrial scale far away, undercuts almost anything a local farm can produce. Researchers say an island needs to grow at least half of its own staple foods to survive a real disruption. Hawaii last crossed that line in the 1960s and has not been close since. So the revival is real, and it is growing, and it is still tiny against the scale of the problem. Whether it can grow fast enough to matter before the next storm closes the harbor, no one yet knows. So we return, one last time, to the question: how do you live on the most isolated islands on Earth? The old answer was the land. The modern answer was the ship. But there is a third answer, older than the kingdom, older than the fish ponds, and in the last 50 years, the islands have been reaching back for it. In the early 1970s, almost no one alive could navigate the way the first Hawaiians had. The knowledge that had carried canoes across the Pacific, the stars, the swells, the birds, had nearly vanished from Hawaii entirely. Skeptics argued the old voyages must have been luck or drift, that no one could really have crossed that much ocean on purpose without instruments. A group of Hawaiians set out to prove otherwise. They built a double-hulled voyaging canoe in the old style and named it Hokulea, the Star of Gladness, the star that passes directly over the islands. And they went looking for someone who still knew how to find land by feel. They found him far to the west, on a tiny island in Micronesia. His name was Mau Piailug, and he was one of the last master navigators of his generation, a man who had been trained from childhood to hold the entire ocean in his head. He agreed to do something his own traditions did not easily allow, to give the knowledge to outsiders so that it would not die. In May of 1976, the Hokulea slips out of a bay in Hawaii and turns south toward Tahiti. More than 2,400 miles of open ocean lie ahead. There is no compass aboard, no charts, no radio for finding the way. There is only Mau, sitting at the back of the canoe, reading the water. He does not sleep, not really, for weeks. He holds the direction in his body, the angle of the swells against the hull, the rising of star after star, the memory of every change in the wind. He carries the position of the canoe in his mind the entire way, with nothing written down. 33 days after leaving, the Hokulea reaches Tahiti. Thousands of people are waiting on the shore. The old skeptics were wrong. The voyages had been real. The knowledge worked. and a people who had been told their ancestors were merely lucky had just been handed back the proof of their own genius. One of the young Hawaiians who sailed with Mao and who set out to learn everything he could from him was a man named Nainoa Thompson. He became the first Hawaiian in centuries to navigate the old way across open ocean, blending Mao's traditional knowledge with his own years of studying the stars. And then he did the thing that mattered most. He taught others, and they taught others. What began as one canoe and one experiment became a revival that swept across the whole Pacific. The Hokulea has now sailed hundreds of thousands of miles. Between 2014 and 2017, it sailed all the way around the world, more than 40,000 nautical miles, to over 150 ports, still without instruments, carrying a message about caring for the earth and the ocean that connects it. That message has a name, Malama Honua, to care for our island earth, and it grows from something every wayfinder learns in their bones. On a voyaging canoe, you carry everything you will have for the entire journey the moment you leave shore. There is no resupply in the middle of the Pacific. You ration, you waste nothing. You take care of the vessel and each other, or you do not arrive. Which is, of course, the oldest Hawaiian lesson of all, stated again in a new way. An island is a canoe. A canoe is an island. Both hold only what they hold, and both depend on the people aboard to manage it wisely. The navigators are not only keeping a sailing technique alive, they are carrying, across the whole world, the exact knowledge their islands forgot. That on a small piece of land in a vast ocean, survival is a matter of stewardship. And the knowledge that nearly died with a single old man in Micronesia is now carried by a new generation. Among them is Lehua Kamalu, the first woman to serve as both lead captain and lead navigator of the Hokulea, guiding the canoe across thousands of miles of open sea by the same stars the first Hawaiians followed here. This is the real answer to how people live on the most isolated islands on Earth. Not the harbor, not the container ships. The deepest answer is the one the first navigators brought with them, that this ocean is not a wall, it is a road, and the people who can read it are never truly cut off from anything. Which makes the last fact of this story the hardest to hold. Because at the very moment, the islands are remembering how to cross the ocean, more and more of their people are crossing it the other way and not coming back. The cost of living has grown so high that Hawaiians are leaving Hawaii. They move to the mainland for housing they could never afford at home, for space, for a paycheck that stretches. They have left in such numbers that for the first time in history, more native Hawaiians now live outside the islands than on them. Many of them have gathered, of all places, in the desert, in Las Vegas, so full of transplanted islanders that locals call it the ninth island. There are Hawaiian restaurants, Hawaiian festivals, whole neighborhoods of people who carry the islands inside them, 1,000 miles from any ocean. On average, Hawaii loses a dozen of its residents to the mainland every single day. So here is where the islands stand. The descendants of the greatest ocean navigators in human history are sailing a canoe around the world to prove they were never lost, while many of their cousins pack up and fly to the desert because they can no longer afford to stay in their own homeland. Both of those things are true at the same time. They have always been the two halves of this place, the genius and the fragility, the ability to live anywhere and the difficulty of living here. And yet the same stubborn refusal that rebuilt the canoe is at work everywhere you look. A century ago, the Hawaiian language was banned in schools and slipping toward extinction. By the 1980s, only a few dozen children still spoke it. Then a handful of families started immersion schools, teaching entirely in Hawaiian, and the language came back from the edge. Children sing in it again. The fish ponds are being rebuilt. The taro is going back in the ground. The navigators are training the next generation. None of it on its own is enough. All of it together is a people deciding, quietly against the math, that they are not finished here. High on the lava fields, the nene, the goose that gave up the sea to walk on stone, that came back from fewer than 30 birds, still raises its young on the slopes of the volcanoes. It is rare. It is watched over. It stays because, against everything, it has found a way. Whether the people of these islands can do the same, whether they can find a way to stay on the most isolated land on Earth without losing it, the way their ancestors once did and then forgot, that question has not been answered yet. It is being asked right now, 2,400 miles from anywhere, on a chain of volcanoes in the middle of the sea. And the only people who can answer it are the ones still there to try. Thank you for traveling with us across the most isolated islands in the world. If this journey meant something to you, subscribe and stay a while. There are more places and more questions waiting just over the horizon. Until the next voyage.